Well, hello, I am Dr. Anthony Edwards, and today we're going to be going over Chapter 15 of our textbook for higher education leadership. We're going to cover organizational change, a matrix approach. All right, so what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to go over barriers to organizational change. We're going to go over the 5 stages of change, considerations for these stages. We're also going to cover the 5x5 matrix of organizational change. And we'll also consider some, some basically little things that we'll have to consider when you look at the different factors that are part of that change matrix. We'll also talk about why sometimes change efforts fail. We'll also talk about principles of organizational change. All right, so what are some barriers to organizational change in higher education? Well, if you think about it, sometimes people don't think change is necessary. They think, why are we want to change things? They work just fine. And maybe they do, maybe they don't. But there might be things that we're seeing that are going to change that we need to adjust to. Some people don't like change because it involves investment of time. They don't want to spend time on that. They have other things to do. They have other work priorities that they need to work on, that they're being measured on, so they don't want to work on anything else. Sometimes change requires people and organizations, departments to acquire new processes, uh, gather new information that they don't already have, develop new skills. So sometimes change is uncomfortable. Also, sometimes organizations, departments don't have all of the resources that they need to change. Also, at times, sometimes change challenges the status quo, and sometimes it can reduce the confidence or trust that members of the organization have in their leadership. And sometimes people are just not ready or prepared for the change. Change gets forced on them, and they're not happy about it. So, what are the 5 stages of change? So, our textbook authors worked on this in an earlier publication, and they came up with 5 stages. And so those are attention, connection, commitment, action, and integration. So with attention, you've got to get the people's attention. If you're going to want to have some sort of change, you have to let them know that there's a change that's necessary. Then you've got to connect with them. You have to engage them, so that you know who the stakeholders are and you engage them. You also have to get them to have some commitment, take some ownership about the change. And then you take some action. Um, Hopefully, that's going to lead you in the direction that you're wanting to go through the change effort. And then you've got to facilitate or integrate the change into your everyday culture, systems, processes, and practices. So, when trying to gain attention on a strategic change effort in higher ed, whether it's in enrollment management or uh, student affairs, academic affairs, there's a couple of things you want to consider. One is to have what we call a burning platform. You got to, you almost kind of have to act like, there's not necessarily there's a crisis, but there's something happening that is, getting people's attention, right? So if you're just saying, hey, this is something I think we need to do, nobody's going to want to do it. But if you're saying, hey, I'm seeing the enrollment trends are for traditional students are going in this direction. If we don't change our recruiting patterns, we're going to have a hard time recruiting. Or, we're noticing that students are having trouble in these classes. If we don't provide more support for them for these classes right now, we're going to lose enrollment in these courses, and it's going to affect our bottom line, and then we'll have less money to pay people. Um, you've got to think about different criteria. Okay, well, student affairs, we're having to justify our existence because we don't have semester credit hours. If we don't show that we're helping students develop marketable skills, we may have a hard time justifying our budget. There's all kinds of ways to get people's attention. The challenge with that is you can run into the attention paradox, where if you uh, cry wolf so many times, so to speak, or you're creating such a dramatic attention grabbing, structure, you might actually make people tune you out. So that's sometimes the attention paradox. Like, okay, here the person comes again, saying that there's a crisis. They just use every crisis to get their way, and that's not what you want. All right. So what are some considerations when you're dealing with connection? Well, you got to figure out who your key internal and stakeholders are, and then you've got to engage them. So engagement can happen in a lot of different ways. But if you don't engage people early and often in a change effort, think strategic planning. You come to people and say, "Hey, we're going to change the uh, software that you use to do advising, or we're going to change the learning management system on the campus. We're going to change the student information system." Uh, if you don't engage the people who are using that system every day, you're going to have some challenges. You change the resources that people access in the library. All kinds of different things could happen. Just and you may think, well, I've engaged with certain stakeholders, but have you engaged as many as possible, so they're educated and informed about what change is happening? And that's not saying change is good or bad. A lot of times they're necessary. Uh, Sometimes it's budget, sometimes it's other decisions that are made above you. But just making sure people are engaged and aware can save you a lot of headache as a higher ed leader. Dialogue, just that regular conversation. How you communicate. What methods do you use to have dialogue? Are you using one-to-one conversations? Are you using town halls? Are you going to various committee meetings, engaging deans, department chairs, uh, you know division meetings, director level meetings for student affairs or enrollment management? How are you engaging people and making sure that they know that the change is coming and why it's necessary? So to foster commitment, things that you can do as a higher ed leader is identify where there's consensus. If you only go for what you want, people are going to see that as a zero-sum game. So in order for you to win, they have to lose. You really figure out where there's consensus, where there's agreement. Then you got to address the barriers. So make sure that they are barriers that are things you can fix. If there's things that you can't fix, you can't fix them. But fix the things you can. Okay. All right, so identifying outcomes is something you can do when you want to facilitate action. So let people know where you're trying to go and how you're going to measure their success. Uh, Figure out what are the behaviors, the actions that are needed in order to achieve the outcome. Right? What are behaviors, and clarifying what actions will get you in the direction of that behavior. Right? So if there are things that need to happen, uh, tell people what they need to do, encourage and promote the behaviors that are necessary. So you can identify all the things they need to do, but if you're not promoting that behavior, you're not recognizing that behavior, people won't necessarily be motivated to help you achieve the outcomes. Now, to integrate your change and prevent backsliding, so to speak, make sure you highlight your changes. You recognizing the people. When there are changes, are you giving updates on how the change is going? Is there some kind of graphic that you can create? Are there regular emails, meetings you can attend that you're doing, going out and doing? Are you recognizing the change agents, the innovators in your organization who are facilitating that change? So, or are you just expecting them to do the work? But because if you just expect them to do the work and you don't recognize them and they're not being paid anything extra, they're probably not going to do as much as they would do for you if you encourage them. Think transformational leadership. Uh, so, figure out what needs to happen to encourage success. Figure out what success structures or systems are needed to help reinforce the change. So If there are things that have to change in the organization for this other change to happen, work on that, facilitate that. Think path goal, you got to clear the path to get to the goal. And then make sure you're regularly reviewing the systems and outcomes, making sure that you're documenting where you're going, how you're making progress along the way. If you look at a lot of strategic plans out there, a lot of times the document just sits online. Some institutions actually post progress trackers or let you know how far they've come along each of those goals. All right, and that's important for keeping people motivated. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the 5x5 matrix organizational change. So here you got stages and factors. So with the stages, we just talked about those, right? That's your attention, connection, commitment, action, and integration. Now we'll layer on that factors, things like leadership, constituencies or stakeholders, communication, culture, and outcomes. All right, so you've got on one phase or one side of this matrix, you've got actions, and the other are more considerations. Okay, if that helps you to organize your thoughts. But at each stage, you got to think about all the factors. Okay, so at the attention stage, when you're trying to get people's attention, what leaders need to be engaged? What other constituencies need to be engaged? How are you going to communicate to get people's attention? What's the culture of the organization? What will work? What won't work? What are the outcomes that you're trying to drive to get attention? What gets you to the next phase for connection? So what's a success? So you got to that's why it's a matrix, because it aligns at each level. So things you want to consider with the change matrix. So for the leadership factor, you want to consider the roles and structures in the organization when it comes to leadership. So if there are people, if you have a certain structure in academic affairs, that will impact your discussion. You have, some institutions where advising is in academic affairs. You have others where it's in student affairs, and others it's in enrollment management. So you got to look at the structure and what roles people play, depending on what it is you're trying to achieve. Clarify the key constituencies. Figure out who needs to be in the conversation. Address them early, often. For communication, think about how you're going to frame your conversation, how you're going to, again, show the need, what strategy, what's your communication plan, how are you going to roll out information to various groups. Compensating for organizational culture. So on that culture umbrella, you got to know your institution. So if your institution, you have to get with faculty on any decision, then you better do that. If you're more of an organization where the senior leadership makes the calls, then you better engage the senior leadership if you're going to need them to champion the results, especially if it involves things that have to happen outside of your area of expertise. Under outcomes, you got to make sure you're recording your progress, all right, and reporting on your progress in achieving the organizational outcomes. So you got to think, if you think, there's a book called The Four Disciplines of Execution, and they talk about lead measures and lag measures. So the lead measures get you toward the lag measure. All right, so you got to be recording and reporting on your progress. Okay, so why do different change efforts fail? Well, for a variety of reasons. Some of the more common ones that our authors have identified include not considering the roles of the various stages of the change process. So, somewhere in that, attention, connection, commitment, action, integration, maybe that you were great at certain areas, but there was one of those stages where you just didn't put enough attention. Okay. On the flip side, with the matrix, you might not have considered all of the factors. Did you include all the leadership who needed to be involved? Did you include the key constituencies? Did you communicate effectively and regularly? Did you take account for the culture? Did you have effective outcomes, so people knew what success looked like. Again, with engagement, making sure that key stakeholders are addressed, that you also make sure if you're a lower level leader, make sure your senior level leaders are engaged and have some buy-in and are effective champions for the change, because in some cases you'll run into folks who will say, well, what does senior leadership think? And I don't want to do this unless senior leadership said that's what we want to do. So come back when you've got senior leadership involved. So make sure they're on board with the change. Some reasons change efforts fail because the leaders didn't take adequate time to focus on getting the buy-in of necessary stakeholders. Maybe they informed them, but they didn't get their buy-in. Because informing and buy-in are not the same thing. Just because you told, enrollment management that we were going to do recruiting in a certain way didn't mean that they agreed with it or they bought into the change. You got to make sure you have both. Ineffective design or implementation of the leadership structure. So when you're putting together a team, sometimes it's not the formal structure. Sometimes you have to put together a project team. Do you have the right people on the team? Does the team have the right structure? Or are you getting to a place where there's a lot of talk and nothing ever gets done? So those are all things you want to think about when you know who's responsible for making a decision, and also who's responsible for getting certain things done. Okay, let's talk a little bit about principles of organizational change. So things that you want to consider here, you want to remember that the change stages as well as the factors have to be considered regardless of how big or how small the change is in that organization. So don't neglect that. Realize that you are going to be likely more focused, more intentional about the different phases of change than other constituencies are, and account for that. They may not know all of this that you know about change, and they may not be as interested. So make sure that you address it, because you can't necessarily depend on others to. You want to make sure you build a team that supports and champions the process of change. If you don't have your core group, it's going to be hard to get things done, because you're most likely not going to be doing everything by yourself. You want to make sure you get other perspectives, good or bad, supportive or not, so that you know how to address things. So sometimes it can be easy to just go on your own journey and what you think is right or what you think you've been told to do, and not consider other people's perspectives. So make sure you get other feedback as you go through the process. You want to make sure that you remember that change has long-term impacts, but also has short-term impacts. So don't think about necessarily, okay, well, we're going to get to this goal and that's where we're getting to, but what other impacts is that going to bring? How else is that going to change your institution now and in the future? And then consider how your change is going to impact other people in the organization and plan accordingly. Sometimes organizations have to restructure. They might have to do layoffs. They might have to do reassignments. They might have to cut resources for things, because there's just not there's not an unlimited budget. So certain things you have to get rid of. But that's going to affect people, whether it's resources or people. So make sure that you plan accordingly and not just make your decisions because it is the right thing for the institution, but people's lives are impacted by this. So make sure that you're considering that. So to review what we've been over today, we've discussed the barriers to organizational change. We've discussed the 5 changes or stages of change. We've discussed considerations for the 5 stages of change. We've discussed 5x5 matrix of organizational change, factor considerations for the change matrix, why do change efforts fail, and principles of organizational change. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, reach out to me, let me know, and we'll see you in the next video.